Thank you, Ginny, and thank you everybody from the library staff who host these wonderful things. I had a chance to watch some of the Distinguished Guest Lecture series, and I'm in really good company, and it's great that this happens here. So please feel free if you need to eat. I realize it's lunchtime, and my lectures and talks always go better when there are more discussions. So I'm going to be asking questions and just not asking anybody to come up and participate, but just hoping that people feel free to make comments and ask questions about things. So I teach quite a few classes here at Yavapai and at NAU. They're all in the human development field, deviant behavior and counseling skills, which I just taught yesterday. And I also work at the health department as a health educator. So I've been around the block, so to speak, in human services in Prescott, Arizona, and a few other states as well. And as Jeannie was saying, I have found that the one thing that really seems to help, no matter who I'm talking to, whether it's a class of kids at a high school locally talking about sex ed or opioid harm reduction, is the fact, or people that are in counseling or groups, is that when I talk about boundaries, people's eyes kind of light up because they realize that they're hearing something that they've known for a long time but maybe never had the words to put to. So one of the things that I really want to talk about today is to make sure that everybody understands a few things. I want you first to realize that boundary work, we started doing it when we were little babies, and we're going to continue to do it till the day that we die. Boundary work is always something that's happening. It's always something that we can look at, think about, examine, take advantage of, and use in ways to make our lives better. So I wanted to show you briefly, what is Yoda doing there in that picture? He's pushing energy back. And what would a child or a young person say about his action? Talk to the hand. Very good. So in this short picture, and you can see if you want to get a hold of me, there's my email. Yoda is demonstrating a style of holding boundaries. Obviously in the movie he's shooting energy at something. But for our purposes he's saying, talk to my hand because I don't want to talk to you. It's a way to make boundaries visible. We're going to be talking a little bit about external, internal, implicit, and explicit boundaries in the way that they're formed and come about. So take a look at this picture. Okay. So in that picture, we have something that is another well-used trope in our language. Like some people say, talk to the hand. What is this hand in this picture actually doing? Drawing a line in the sand. And when we say we're drawing a line in the sand, what does that usually mean?
Boundary line. Can't cross it.
It's something that is a limit that we're actually making explicit in front of other people. It's usually because maybe there's some kind of conflict going on, or there's some kind of conflict that we're seeking to avoid. We're saying, I'm drawing a line in the sand. This is where my boundaries begin. So what I'd like you to do, I want to do a quick activity. And again, all people have to do is actually tell me what they think of. When I say the word boundary or boundaries, tell me what you think of. Let me just pull this up. Perfect. I'm going to type in a few of those things so we can see those words. When I say the word boundary or boundaries, what are some words that come into your head?
Fences.
Fences, okay. Go ahead while I'm typing up stuff.
Snow.
Snow?
No.
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 Respect.
Limits.
Borders.
State boundaries.
Protection.
Protection.
Don't go any further, don't go beyond.
So almost a sign, like a words or an actual warning in some way.
It's more of a warning.
Okay. Anybody else?
Rules.
Rules.
Self-respect. Needed space.
So needed space for somebody or needed space between people, perhaps? That's a great list. Let's take a look at those words for a moment. We've got things that happen inside of us, things that we feel, maybe think, perceive. We've got things that delineate a change, a state borders. I always like to joke that whenever I take an airplane, I look down and I don't see the different colored states. I don't know why, but they're not different colors. And you know, we can definitely see borders from the airplanes when we're in them. We can see how the United States ends and borders with the coasts. We can see rivers that sometimes separate states. So we can see a lot of different things, but how many people have gone to the Four Corners area and actually stood on the area? Now, is there a little plaque or something there? There's nothing there. It's just kind of invisible because it's something that, unless you're a geographer, you're not really going to think a lot about. So one thing I want you to realize with this is that boundaries can be completely 100% explicit, understood, talked about, valued by the community, or they can be things that we just kind of almost take for granted as norms. You know, some of these things about protection, certainly we can see when we go to an old mine up the highway off Center Highway, we'll see signs that say danger, stay out, open pit mine. And that's a very clear boundary warning. But there's other things that are a little bit harder to grasp. So let's take I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. Let me just make sure that I do this. Okay, so let's look at some of the definitions that the rest of the world uses, then we'll make up our own definition of what boundaries actually are. So here's from our favorite Merriam-Webster's. It's letting us know in no uncertain terms that boundaries are, definition of boundaries, something that indicates or fixes a limit or an extent. For example, those two trees mark the boundary of our property. The mountain range that forms the country's northern boundary. Pretty self-explanatory. Here's from Wikipedia, something that many of our students love to use, so I thought I'd use it as well. Personal boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave towards them and how they will respond when someone passes those limits. They're built out of a mix of conclusions, beliefs, opinions, attitudes, past experiences, and social learning. So we're getting a little bit closer to some of the boundaries I'm talking about. There's certainly geographical boundaries that are real. There's sociological boundaries, but for our purposes, we're going to be looking at healthy boundaries in our lives, so personal boundaries. So here's some related words, just to kind of get our minds going on this idea. I'll read a few of them. Perimeter is a boundary. Borderline, obviously. Frontier, you think about the way that the American West was populated. It was the great frontier. Oftentimes on maps we see that, old maps especially, we talk about where maybe the earth ended and there was just space, so there'd be monsters. Edge, horizon, some synonyms, bound, cap, ceiling, confines, ends, extent, limit, all those different kinds of things. So we have a lot of different definitions, but this next one is by far my favorite. This is from the English Language Learner's Dictionary. So this is a dictionary that might be given to a class of ESL students that maybe are coming to America for the first time. So it gives a very wide angle view of what all these words mean so that maybe somebody from another country whose English is not their first language can understand. Something such as a river, fence, or an imaginary line that shows where an area ends and another area begins. A point or limit that indicates where two things become different. Please take note of that one. And unofficial rules about what should not be done, limits that define acceptable boundaries. It's fascinating when you think about how we educate people that are not from this country, and some of the words. The English language is incredibly complex, and when we look at boundaries, there's a lot of different ways we can think about them. So in this picture, I love this picture, we're looking at an example of an everyday boundary issue between two animals. So what do we see happening there, literally? The dog is sitting on the cat, and some of my students said that the cat already looks mad. But what do we feel like is going to happen in that picture eventually?
What do you? Dog's going to move.
Because?
Because the cat's going to finally get fed up.
The cat's going to be fed up. The cat looks a little bit good-natured right now, but what we're seeing is an example of if you have pets in your house, if you have kids, if you have a lot of people that you're standing close to on public transportation, eventually one of our boundaries might be crossed inadvertently. The boundary I'm talking about is our personal space boundary. So when we think about an invisible boundary, I'm not one of those people that can see auras, but apparently there are some people that are able to see people's auras, and I don't really see it as like a force shield around us, but that's how some people think of our personal space boundaries. So when we think about personal space bubbles, let me tell you a brief story from when I was a child. I grew up outside Pittsburgh, and I was a shy, quiet kid, and when I went from elementary school to middle school, I got some new friends, and one of my friends, his name was Elon Fong. That was his real name. And he was kind of a sharp guy. You know, you'd have to be with a name like Elon Fong. And I always was very jealous of Elon because he always seemed to get what he wanted. And I decided I'd watch him. You know, we loved comic books, so we'd trade back and forth, and he was kind of one of my guys and I was one of his. And I noticed that he always got me to do what he wanted. And what I noticed was that Elon would come up to somebody that he wanted something from. It could have been a teacher, it could have been a friend, it could have been a parent, it could have been anybody. And he would come up real close and he'd put his arm around the person and he'd draw his face very close to that person's ear. And he'd whisper very quietly, like, "Chris, I think we should go to King's Restaurant and we should go try to meet some people there." And I was very uncomfortable because the only time that I would let people into my intimate space, even before I had a girlfriend, was family members. The intimate space bubble that we have around people that we completely trust usually are family members. And he was coming into my intimate space. And he was creating a situation where if maybe I'd been a little bit older and a little bit more sure of myself, I could have said, "Ooh, get away from me." You know, I could have been like, "Why are you trying to get what you want by getting in my personal space?" But as a 6th grader, 7th grader, I didn't know any of that stuff. And I watched Elon all the time. He always did the same thing with people. And because of that, he was a very popular person. I don't know if it was popular in a good way or a bad way. But that was one of my first introductions to the idea that personal space boundaries and personal space bubbles are a good place to teach people about boundary work, because when you have somebody like Elon in your life, you're going to remember that. You're going to remember when somebody gets in your space. So I like to start out any conversation telling that story. I think that one of the things I really want you to hear about that was that at that point, all of us learned boundaries from the very beginning from our caregivers. You know, how we're treated by our families friends, teachers, we're going to learn a lot of different things. In the sociological world, they're called norms, the kind of unspoken rules about how we should act, what we should say, what we shouldn't act like, what we shouldn't do, what we shouldn't say. And at that point in my family, the normal rule was, the norm was that if you were hugging somebody, maybe saying goodnight or greeting somebody, you hug them. But you don't really get close to people in that way. I grew up in Pittsburgh, originally from Buffalo, and out east, space bubbles are different than they are in the West. We'll get more into that. So let me give you an example of growing up with another kind of boundary. I hope everybody can see that. That is literally something called the Bicker Barrier. You can buy this off eBay. And it is a little device that you install, and you can take the curtain and pull it between people in the back seat. Now, why do you think somebody would want to do that?
I wouldn't like it.
If you were sitting in the back seat? Yeah. As a child or as an adult?
Well, either way.
Either
I
way.
mean, if you don't like somebody, you don't, even though they're next to you, you don't have to talk to them.
Yeah.
I mean, and kids, I know they fight. I've had 2 kids. They, one wants to do this, one. But if you put a bubble like that between them, and you don't, as your authority as a parent, tell them you don't act that way. We'll take care of this when we get home or whatever.
Yeah.
Then I think that builds up an isolation situation. They don't learn to deal with each other.
You're bringing up some really important points about the messages that we give about boundaries. In this picture, the kids are smiling, probably because they have good parents that said, hey, we're going to go on a trip. It's going to be several hours. You're going to have to learn to get along. You don't necessarily need to see each other, but you definitely need to be able to behave so your dad or your mom doesn't crash the car because you guys are fighting. So in my life, the Bicker Barrier was not something that I ever thought of, but I wish, now that I think about it, that I had one. My parents would have installed one, because my sister Carolyn and I, it was brutal. She's 3 years younger than me. She's a 9th grade English teacher in Glendale right now. She's doing great. I think she was able to...
Bickering didn't hurt.
Yeah, exactly. The bickering that we did. And anytime that she would take anything of hers, like her Barbie dolls or her blanket or her coloring books, and they went over that invisible line in the middle of the seats, I would get so mad, and I would feel the urge to take whatever she had and pretend to throw it out the window, which of course would cause huge fighting, and my dad and mom would be very upset with me as we drove down to wherever we were going, generally Nags Head or the Delaware Water Gap. So let me show you another example of a Bicker Barrier that I like even a little bit more. This is a picture of a dad. I found this on Google Images, who created, and let's hope that's not wood or anything so the kids aren't getting splinters, but in this picture the dad is actually saying, look what I did. I created a Bicker Barrier for my 2 very young kids, and using ingenuity rather than spending probably $50 on eBay for that. So everything that we see communicates a boundary. Right now, I'm separated from you by just this lectern, but it actually is a boundary. The way that we have these chairs here, they're arranged in rows so that somebody would be able to walk down between the boundary and not trip over anybody. The windows are a boundary. What do they keep out?
Javelina, I saw one today.
Yes.
Right next to the library window.
Yes. So this is a library. In addition to animals, what is one of the most important things to keep out of libraries?
Hot sun.
Hot sun and sounds, noise especially. If you think about most rooms, they are designed to keep people out in a way or keep something in. So when we think about boundaries, we want to start to think about what is their function or their use or their purpose. A lot of boundaries that we see every day, like the bookshelves here, they have many different purposes, but Each bookshelf has certain numbers that we know there's certain books are going to be, and we can use the card catalog, haha, like we've seen a card catalog in years. But we can use the system to find what we want. The card catalog or the computers is another boundary system. It's the way that we organize information. So everything that we have on, my clothes right now, your clothes, they're all expressions of our boundaries, how we express who we are as people. So when we start to really think about boundary work, we have to start to think on a lot of different levels. What I'm going to be talking about mostly is healthy boundaries between people and within ourselves. So I'd like to give you part of a definition. A boundary is a limit that promotes integrity. So if there was a crack in the window and the marching band or somebody was playing loud music, we would hear it. But because the window is solid and we can see through it, even if somebody's making a ton of noise out there and being a real pain, we still can't hear what they're saying. So a boundary, first and foremost, is something that protects the integrity of one or two things. So think about a boundary right now that all of us don't think about at all, but it protects us every second of every day. What is it?
Skin.
Perfect. You guys are really on top of things. Our skin is the primary boundary membrane that protects us, keeps out what we don't want in us, and keeps in what we do want to keep within us. And even within our skin, think about if our stomach acids were able to travel throughout our body when we were digesting food. That would be a disaster. We want boundaries in our body to keep certain things away. Our stomach acid doesn't belong up near our brainstem, it belongs down here. Our waste, urine, all those different things, we want those far away from the areas where we're going to be taking food in. So one thing I want you to know about boundaries right off the bat is that boundaries often require maintenance. When we get cut, what do we do with a cut? A small cut, not a big one.
Band-Aid.
We use a Band-Aid. A Band-Aid is a temporary boundary that helps us keep the integrity of our body because we don't want what getting inside of our cuts. Germs, bacteria, dirt, whatever it may be. Because if we don't maintain our boundaries, literally our skin, we open ourselves for infection. And when we open ourselves for infection, that can be really negative. So if you can start to think about the idea that sometimes words and actions can very much be similar to positive or negative things that are coming around us. Sometimes, I don't want to be too negative and call them infectious-like things, but when somebody says something to us that might be very upsetting, it's almost like we have to think about, do I want to let that in? Is that true? Is that real? Is that something that is really valid for me to have to listen to? Or do I want to keep that energy or voice or thought or whatever away? And we're going to talk about that in just a moment, but suffice to say is that a really good example of one of the boundaries I have is that I literally do not watch any TV at all. I watch videos on TV, and I've got a DVD player, but I find that anytime I watch any kind of advertisements or the news especially, it's assaultive to me as a person. And I'm not judging anybody that watches news or watches TV. I'm not saying I'm better or worse than anybody. I'm just saying for me, I realize that my boundaries need to be protected very, very clearly by not engaging in certain activities that the vast majority of other people do.
I don't think you're alone in that,
Right.
especially as you get older.
Yes,
I don't-
especially lately. So think a little bit about how boundaries are set up. When we're little babies, what do little babies, besides cry and soil their diapers and nurse, what do they do more than anything when they get to be about a year old? They do, but as they're getting into everything, they're ambulatory. What are they doing? They're learning to walk. And so what do they do more than anything? They bump into things and they fall down. So think a little bit about the way that a child teaches a baby about walking. Can you imagine if every baby, all of us included, were met with like, oh, you're never going to walk. You're never going to get it right. You know, get yourself back up. You made a mistake. You bumped into that. Why are you crying? You hit your head on the side of that table. That's not okay. That's not how anybody acts, because we realize that the kids are going to learn and grow at their own pace. And if we are always there with a helping hand, supporting somebody and exploring their boundaries, which sometimes boundaries hurt. Like when we walk into a door or we're told no about something, it can be very, very hard for us at times. So when we think about boundaries, we have to always start with our youth and think about what are the boundaries that we learned about life? Which ones are things that are maybe outdated? You know, in my life, one of the things that happened in Pittsburgh schools was we had a creature, not McGruff the crime dog, I can't remember its name, but it was a horse-like creature. And this creature came to our kindergarten class, I'll never forget this, and he said, "Nay, nay, from strangers stay away." And that was stranger danger back in the 70s when I was growing up. So that was a very, very important lesson for a young child to learn, to stay away from strangers. What if I would have kept doing that throughout my entire life?
Be an isolationist.
I wouldn't be here because you'd all be strangers and I would stay away from you.
You'd be in a cabin in the woods.
Exactly. Boundaries are meant, and messages about boundaries, ideally they're meant to give us information that's useful at that point in our lives, and we're supposed to be able to think about things and try things out, because if I stayed away from strangers, the next time I went to school or the next year in classes, everybody that would be new would be a stranger, and I would think, I can't be here. So boundaries are meant to be things that, you know, create integrity, make a limit, but also at the same time they're meant to be explored pretty constantly. And one of the good things about boundary work is that anybody can learn about their boundaries by becoming more aware. I'm going to go over this at the very end. And we can change our boundaries. Even if we were raised in a very difficult environment with a lot of negative things, we can still decide how we want to come across in the world. So let me take you to another example of personal space bubbles. Oh wait, I'm sorry, this is one, I missed one slide. This is personal space bubbles. Let's talk about cultural things. This is personal space bubbles in the United States. I was talking before about how my friend Elon would get right next to me into my intimate distance. That's where I let people in that I'm in love with or I'm related to, people that I let hug me. And then personal distance is kind of a catch-all thing for folks that maybe we know, maybe acquaintances, maybe good friends, maybe there's friends that we have that we would be very happy to shake their hand, but we don't want a hug from them. Social distance is for people that we might know, might not know, and then public space is when we're walking down the street. So I don't know about anybody else, but I'm very protective of my personal space. If I'm walking in the halls of Yavapai College or in the library and I see somebody I know, I might signal them, say, hey, what's going on? If I see somebody acting that I know in a way that's really weird, I might even go over to them. But if I'm walking on Whiskey Row on Saturday night and I see somebody stumbling around, I'm going to know that I don't want to be close to that person because I don't want to get throw up on my shoes. You know what I mean? So these personal space bubbles, they're really different in different countries too. Has anybody here been to the Far East, for example?
Been to Thailand.
So do you ride any public transportation in Thailand?
Yeah, these little carts,
Mm-hmm.
they're like little buses, but there's two seats, they're open,
Mm-hmm.
2 seats in the back, and one in the front if you need to. And
Those sound like
I forgot
fun.
what they call them.
Yeah,
Tuck.
yeah. How about anybody that was on like a bus or a train or anything like that?
Italy.
Very close.
Very close. And if you go to Norway, believe it or not, in some Scandinavian countries, their space bubbles, from what I've read, I've never been there, but their space bubbles are even bigger than ours. Ours is about out to here. So when thinking about boundary work, we also need to be thinking about what is our culture saying to us about space, you know? And I'm going to get to an example of a different culture. This is a real thing. This was printed on a computer, 3D printing. This is a Dutch designer named Anouk Wiptret. I don't know how to say her name. What this is a dress. I call it function and form at the same time. Fashion and awareness collide. This entire thing is actually controlled by microchips inside the actual dress. And what the microchips do, they measure body perspiration, temperature, respiration, almost like if we were hooked up to a machine in an ambulance. And what these things do is that if the wearer's heartbeat raises or the perspiration starts a little bit more, these things extend out like that. These little things that look like eyes are actually LED lights. And if somebody approaches too quickly, the lights might flash like warning, but if somebody approaches that the person feels comfortable with, they glow very nicely. So it all depends on how the chips are programmed for the person wearing the dress. This is a very interesting idea that I know many people would want to wear something like this, not only because it's so interesting looking, but because it has the function of defining one's boundaries in very solid ways. If you want to get poked in the eye, you know, you should approach this person very quickly and try to scare them, because these things are going to shoot out and it's going to be very unpleasant.
Nice and deep.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it'd be really great for a first date, you know. Both the people, I think, would really benefit from having the initial feedback, you know, because we can't really control our perspiration or heart or respiration that well comparatively. So that's an example of something that very few people would use. But let's take a look at something that many people use. So that's a t-shirt. It says, "No hugs, respect my personal space." I've found that in our world, everybody likes to have messages like this. Not exactly these, but memes and vines and Facebook posts are all giving us words and pictures and images all together saying, these are my boundaries, this is what I care about. Just this weekend, I got a bunch of clothes from my brother-in-law, who's actually taller than me, but about the same size. And there's a bunch of different t-shirts and nice shirts and stuff. And one of the shirts was a Star Wars shirt that has a at one of those big ones that crawl around from Empire Strikes Back. And I was walking around with my 17-year-old son and my buddy John. And we were cruising around downtown, and we went to the Hacienda Inn, and they were having a convention of psychics and palm readers and mediums and all these different things. And I just walked in, you know, I was looking at everything, checking everything out, and a gentleman said, "Are you going to buy Disney Direct?" And I was thinking to myself, who starts a conversation about Disney Direct? I just didn't know what he was talking about. He's like, "That's where The Mandalorian is." And he was completely assuming, based on my dress, that I knew everything about Star Wars, because Disney Direct is the only place that you can get the show about Boba Fett, The Mandalorian. And so I'm never going to wear that shirt again, because I don't want to be talked to by people I don't know about something that they think I'm into. So again, everything really communicates our boundaries. It's a very important thing. Let me give you an example of another one. I'm not antisocial, I just have a personal space bubble. It just so happens that the radius is 5 miles long. So that's somebody that certainly is an isolationist, a person who doesn't want to necessarily be around a lot of folks. And there's a lot of things like this we might see, memes, however. Here's another one. It's one of these EE cards, which are really kind of amusing. "If you can't respect my invisible personal space bubble, then I cannot be held liable for my coffee breath. Consider yourself warned." So instead of a person getting close to me asking for what they want in my ear like Elon did, This could be a coworker who maybe wears too much perfume. You know, again, we carry boundaries with us. And I'm not sensitive to things like that, but when somebody has enough perfume on, I will kind of move away from them because it's a little bit hard for me to be assaulted with that smell. Again, not saying right or wrong, I'm just saying for me. So another example of growing up in Pittsburgh is I had a teacher named Miss Shagru. And if that gives you any idea of what kind of teacher she was like, that name just, to me, evokes different kinds of things like molds and all different kinds of things. But she was a really scary person, and I was terrified to get close to her because she would drink coffee, and she wore a lot of lipstick, and she also had a crack in one of her teeth. And every day when she'd call me up to answer questions about my homework or anything, I could smell everything about her coffee and her perfume, but just her vibe that she gave off, I noticed that always a little bit of the lipstick would get into the crack in her teeth. And it was just terrifying. I mean, I just thought, Wizard of Oz, Wicked Witch of the West. So she was a person that I didn't want to let anywhere close to my personal boundaries, but she wouldn't abide by anything else. She would really try to pull kids in to make them do work up on the board. Here's an example of social boundaries. These things are all the rage nowadays. People are spending a ton of money to get these special doorbells that you can look on your phone and see who's knocking on your door, whether you're at work or on vacation. And these make a video recording of who's at your door and why. So you can see a lot of YouTube videos where people wait for packages and they have somebody come and steal them. These are very much one of the things I want you to look at. This is the actual advertisement that I took off of a web page. Notice it says regulate and discriminate. That's actually pretty great to think about all kinds of boundaries, because in this example it's saying we need to regulate and discriminate who comes into our apartment area, our housing community, our college, or whatever. Regulation and discrimination aren't necessarily bad words. They're words that help us figure out what our limits are. And what these electronic devices do is they really help clarify what our boundaries are. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Let's talk about the different kinds of boundaries. We've gone over quite a few already. We've got physical boundaries, which include the space bubble. A physical boundary, a real one, and an explicit one is our skin, but an implicit one might be our personal space bubble. We've got emotional, like I don't want to be around people that are into the Ku Klux Klan because it feels assaultive on my senses. We have sexual boundaries. Who I choose to share my intimate body with is up to me and me alone. Nobody can come in and make me act in a sexual way if I don't want it. Spiritual and emotional boundaries. If I believe something, that's only on me, it's not on anybody else. I don't have to face anybody else's view of that except for what my own beliefs are. Intellectual boundaries, people telling us that we should think about something in a certain way. You're not seeing it the way I want you to. You know, we hear that quite a bit in debates and arguments. There's all different kinds of boundaries. Obviously, social, a ton of social boundaries. We always are getting into those. In each experience we go to, we are carefully, whether we realize we're doing this or not, we're carefully looking at how people are acting, and we're making sure that we are acting within the norms of that specific situation. The way that we greet a relative would be very different from the way we greet a coworker or going to a party. Some boundaries are incredibly easy for us to maintain. When a person comes to the table and says, "Can I give you a refill?" That's a very easy boundary for us to maintain. No thank you or yes. I want some or I don't want some. Other boundaries are incredibly complex and difficult. I remember when I was in college, coming back from Pittsburgh to come back to Prescott, I was in a VW bus with my friends and we decided we'd go to New Orleans. And in New Orleans, I had one of the most important experiences in my young life. I got swindled or suckered. And people that swindle others, they look for a specific kind of person. So I guess when I was 19 or 20, maybe I looked a certain way. And they use all different ways to get people to give them what they want, which is almost always money. So at that point, I had on these really cool cowboy boots that I had bought. And this guy came up to me and said, "Hey man, I bet I know where you got them boots." And I thought, in my logical mind, there's no way this guy knows where I got these boots. I bought them in Missoula, Montana on another trip. How would he know? There's just no way. I wasn't thinking through it. I was just like, yeah, how much you want to bet? Because I thought maybe I could win some money. And he's like, all right, $5. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, does anybody know what he says? He goes, you got them boots on your feet. And he held out his hand and I gave him the $5 because he swindled it out of me fair and square. And that's an example of, you know, somebody using their knowledge about people in a way that kind of invaded my boundaries. So let's get into that whole idea of, let's talk a little bit about boundary issues because they're very, very important to clarify. So there's two different types of boundary issues we're going to talk about, and one of them has two different categories. The first boundary issue is what we call a boundary error. Boundary errors are actually how we grow. We are all made of mistakes. The things that we did when we were babies learning to walk, the things that we did when we were learning to drive cars, the things we did when we shut our mouths off, all the different things that we've done and still continue to do this day are errors in the fact that they're non-intentional and they help us clarify something, especially if we have helpful people around us. So a boundary error is a unintentional boundary crossing that happens regularly to help us delineate limits. So if I'm walking around, I like to talk with my hands and I like to walk around. And if I came by mistake and I hit your cane and it hurt you, I would feel so bad. I'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'd apologize right away. And I would realize maybe I shouldn't be using my hands and walking around so much. It's an error. It's pretty easy. It wasn't intentional. Sometimes when I pull out into traffic, when I'm driving in Phoenix, sometimes I get a little bit tense. And sometimes when I'm trying to get on the on-ramp and I'm waiting and there's all these cars coming, they're coming faster than I think. I pull out and sometimes I hear beep, beep, beep. And it's because somebody's really mad because I've invaded their space in their car. You know what I mean? It's something that is really scary. And I kind of go like this, like, sorry, you know, like I know they can't see me or even hear me, but I'm trying to let them know that it was really just an honest mistake. So boundary errors are things that are non-intentional, okay? And boundary errors happen all the time. When we talk to a person from a different culture or a different country, all the time. I remember growing up, I went over to my friend Lynn's house, and he was from a very old-time Norwegian family, and I asked if I could get something to drink, and I reached up without waiting for him to say something, and I grabbed a cup, and he got really upset with me. I'm like, why are you mad at me? He's like, you're not supposed to be handling anything. I'm supposed to offer you things, and I'm supposed to give you things. And that was an example of a boundary that I crossed that I had no idea about. I was just a kid. I just thought, there's a cup, I'm going to grab it. So boundary errors are not bad in any way, shape, or form. We definitely want to avoid them. I don't want to really, you know, run into anybody, or I don't want to get close to fender benders. But when they happen, ideally we have a chance to talk about them. The other kind of boundary issue is what we call a boundary violation. And when I do counseling with people, these are things that people have to ask a lot about, you know, and I'll talk about some sensitive things, but for example, when both men and women used to come to me, when I was the counselor at Prescott College, they would ask me, do you think I was date raped? And I would ask some questions and I would say, well, let's talk about boundaries. is that a touch that you wanted? Were you in your normal way of relating to people, or were you taken advantage of? And almost always people would say, oh, I get it now. That was something that I wasn't looking for, I wasn't asking for, it was done against me. So the first kind of boundary violation that I want to talk about, and boundary violations are intentional crossing of some type of boundary. So we might say, in personal boundaries, we can think of a lot of different things, but I like to talk about the time that I spent picking raspberries as a kid. We called them Jagger bushes, you know, in the parlance of the Pittsburghese. And almost always while I was picking these things with friends or my sister or my mom, we would get barbed, you know, by the thorns. And right there, it was a violation of my skin, but it wasn't like the raspberry bush was intentionally trying to hurt me. It was just something that happened. Whereas with, you know, we might stub our toe. That's not intentional, it's kind of a mistake, but it still hurts. You know, boundary violations don't necessarily have to be things that are intentional. They can hurt either way. Whereas when somebody is trying to pull the wool over our eyes, you know, a lot of boundaries have to do with trust. Like the thing that I talked about before with the guy that was trying to get money off me for my boots, that was me being a naive kid that was much too trusting of other people. Like, there's no way this guy knows where these boots came from. It was just kind of, you know, I don't want to say not clear thinking, but I just wasn't old enough yet. So the violations, intentionally violating the integrity of something, an assault or a disregarding of boundaries. And then the other kind, actually the two different kinds, we've got an intrusion violation, which would be the Jagger bush or somebody date raping somebody, a violation of boundaries that involves a penetration. What is inside is spilled out and exposed. So we don't want anything in our bodies to come out unless we choose it to come out. You know what I mean? We don't want our blood to come out. We want to keep it inside. So an intrusion boundary would be a thorn or stepping on a tack or something. The other kind, and obviously we could talk forever about all the intrusion violations that are happening in this country now with certain people in the media and people in our lives probably. The other kind of boundary violation is what we call a gap or distance violation. And a gap or distance violation is when a person fails to act or respond verbally or otherwise when action is called for. So I was thinking about this yesterday when I was talking to students, and I used this new idea is that if there's a family picnic with a bunch of different families, it's going to be fun. And there's always going to be kids, and let's say that most picnics happen Granite Creek Park or wherever, you know, someplace nice. If there's a kid, a little kid who's like 2, running around, there's going to be a lot of people in that group, whether that kid's family or not, that is going to be watching all the kids to make sure that they don't go where? In the water, or maybe close to the road, or close to the bathrooms without an adult. It's kind of a social thing that people are maintaining boundaries for people that don't know any better. Because little kids, they just want to explore and have fun, and we have to teach them what their boundaries are. You know, I think that the time of boundary setting with children is certainly within the first 5 years of life, but then it happens all over again with teenagers, because teenagers, that's how they grow and learn, is that they push boundaries. That's kind of their prime directive. And if you have teenagers, you know what I'm talking about. So when we think about a group of people having a picnic, doing something fun, there's going to be people that are always going to be watching out. A gap or distance violation would be if many of the people at that party were drunk and weren't paying attention. It wouldn't necessarily be anybody's fault that they weren't looking, but because of imbibing drugs and alcohol perhaps, they weren't able to do something that would be expected in normal situations. So gap and distance violations, it's as much what we don't do as much as what we do, if I could say that in a funnier way. A gap or distance violation is a little bit harder to get a handle on because it's more about how we're supposed to act and we choose not to. So these things, I've heard thousands of variations on all these things in personal therapy when I work with people, because a lot of the time people don't know, like, should I be mad about this? Should I be upset? Well, tell me a little bit about what you did and what the situation was about. I find that when people clarify and learn about these two different errors and violations, both distance, gap, and intrusion violations, generally they start to have a much better sense of why they're upset and how maybe they can fix it. So let's chat a little bit about regulation and boundary setting. So in order for us to set boundaries, the first thing that I would suggest is that we have to really know ourselves. I'm not saying like you have to have a Buddha-like knowledge of yourself, but really being okay with who you are and what you believe in. Like I said, some people, like especially kids, when I tell them that I don't eat meat, they get very upset with me because I've been a vegetarian since I've been 16, and I'm not saying that anybody should or shouldn't be a vegetarian. I'm just saying that it works for me. And I remember when I worked up at Skyway as a wilderness director, and I couldn't eat in the dining hall after a while because kids would get really mad at me because I didn't eat meat. And I was showing them that I was a little bit different. And that boundary for them, that was a violation. Like, how dare you not eat meat around us? So I realized very quickly that I couldn't eat in the dining hall anymore. And again, this isn't about me. It's more looking at what the boundaries and norms of groups of people are like. We have to really be honest with ourselves and say, this is who I am, this is what I believe in, this is what I want. Once we know ourselves, and that's an ongoing thing that never stops, because we're always changing, we're always getting in new situations where our boundaries are being tested. We have to notice where a boundary could or did exist. A lot of the times we get ourselves into pickles because we didn't know. Like when I reached for the cup in that guy's house, maybe I should have been a little bit more polite and asked first, can I get my own water? You know, I don't know how I would have said it, but it's very important when we think about especially social situations to really look at what's happened before, because sometimes it's good to do new things, but other times it's not. I'm going to get more into these things in just a moment. Creating, and then the most important thing is stating what we expect and what we want, especially in intimate relationships. It's one of the easiest places to start. Like, let's use a family member. A family member might say, have you heard what happened today in the news? Blah, 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 blah. And before we know it, we've heard our family member's description of all these very upsetting events that we know are upsetting them. But it's what, in the parlance of the time, some people call TMI, too much information. Too much information is something that many people, I know I've been guilty of it, of just kind of opening up and letting out all these different things that makes somebody feel a little bit assaulted. So an example of letting somebody know about your boundaries would be like, I want to hear what you have to say on this subject that's very important to you for 5 minutes. And then after 5 minutes, I'm going to want to talk about something else. It's very, very polite, but you have to be very mindful and intentional. One of the things about boundary work I've found is the more intentional we can become, the better off everybody's going to be. Because there's many areas in all of our lives. I'll give you an example where we go into a place where the boundaries are different and we have to learn to adapt. The dog park down, across from the car dealership. When you go to the dog park, you have to know who you are, who you want to have around you, and realize that you're going to get slobber on you. Because if you like dogs and you go there and you think, I like dogs but I don't want them to slobber on me, you're going to have to really decide quickly how to keep dogs away, because some dogs just are going to come right to you. It's just the way it is. So identify, stating, and setting, and then maintaining it. Because for a lot of people, I like to say that we can ask for what we want. There's no guarantee that we're going to get it. But if we continually maintain a boundary of something that we expect or want, we have more of a chance of getting it. Like, certain animals, certain kids, they have no concept of boundaries, and we have to continually say, don't jump up on that table, that's not good, or don't put that in your mouth. We have to teach people about boundaries. The more that we embody our own boundaries, the better off we're going to be, and I'm going to get into that in this last slide. So another 3 things I just want to say about this is a lot of boundaries have to do with limiting something. So limiting what we hear, what we're a part of, what we're around. A simple way of saying it is limit your exposure to words or actions of others. I limit the way that I hear people talk about culture by not watching the news. I'm very guilty of listening to NPR, so I get some semblance of what people believe about things that way. But I'd much rather talk to people about things. Another thing is to, instead of limit, would be to include. And when I say include, that means you're inviting people that you feel good about, that you want to be around to open up and talk about specific things. So if I went to a coffee shop and there was somebody there that I wanted to invite into my world, I would say, let's talk about this. If there was somebody that was just talking to me and wanted my attention and giving me too much information, I try to limit what I was getting from them. And the last word that I would use, again, it doesn't mean a bad word, it just means that we have to be very discriminatory. We have to really decide who we want to let in, our field of vision, our field of hearing, close to us, whatever way. You know, if Ilan Fong came up to me right now, I'd give him a hug, but I wouldn't let him talk in my ear because I realize that that doesn't work for me. And, you know, I shouldn't tell anybody about that because suffice to say, if somebody tried to take advantage of me, they'd know where one of my weak spots would be, whispering in my ear. I want you to think about boundaries as if they are very specific protective gear. If you think about some people's boundaries, it's almost like they're walled off and they don't really experience all that life has to offer, almost like they have a suit of armor on because they've been hurt many times. I like to encourage people to work on boundaries almost as if they're preparing for a sporting event where they might get in the path of something. You know, when you play softball, you wear specific things that protect very important parts of the body. You don't wear pads all over your entire body. Of course, if you play football, you might want those pads all over your body. I think it's really important that as I said, observe and maintain. I think it's really important that we choose very carefully where we want to let things in and where we want to keep things out, like our skin does for us, and we don't give it any thanks almost. So boundary awareness in everyday life, let me sum things up with just a few more important things, and I'll be able to take some questions. This says, what boundaries can be used to keep myself in a healthy state of mind, body, and spirit? That's something that I can't answer for you. It's something that would come through in your own contemplative time. When I'm by myself, with my family, with my friends, at work, at the mall, I'm a very social person a lot of my life. Like, I get paid to talk to groups of people about things like I'm doing right now. Once I'm done with it, I like to go home and talk to my animals. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want anybody to talk to me about anything that I don't want them to talk to me about. So when I think about my boundaries around people are very different from my boundaries when I'm alone. So with friends, at work, at the mall, you know, walking around on Whiskey Row will definitely give you a chance to talk about your, explore your boundaries. How can I use boundaries to enact my values? This is probably the most important thing. I gave a presentation at Yavapai College at the Summer Institute, and people were asking me about how to get more learning done in classes, and I said, if I could give you one suggestion, it would be to use a syllabus quiz, because people often say, I didn't know we were supposed to do that, or I didn't know the rules. If you put into the class, you know, a syllabus quiz, then you know that somebody at least has taken the time to read the syllabus quiz, and you can't say, they can't say I didn't know about that. I actually...
what does that mean, syllabus quiz?
Oh, so syllabus is when somebody takes a class, any class, usually a college class, and it has all the information about what the teacher expects from students. So it's got the schedule, the way that people are supposed to do projects, how much things count for. So a syllabus is just, in the education world, sometimes I forget that I'm not talking to people that have made education a life, which I normally talk to. It's just kind of the agreement that the teacher uses with the students about how the class is going to be taught. Does that make sense? Thank you for asking. I'm sorry I didn't specify that. So here's the very last thing, and then we'll get into questions. The very last thing is I want to talk about boundaries both as a personal journey, but also as a social journey, in the fact that as people or systems begin to institute more appropriate boundaries, people will begin to act differently. The more effective you become in embodying your boundaries, the more effective people in your sphere of influence will become in relation to you. Each time you set a boundary that is healthy, it has a cumulative effect. And that's what we talk about in changing the world. What Gandhi said, you know, if you want, and I don't know if he actually said it, but the whole idea, if you want to change the world, change yourself. And it really has a lot to do with how we handle interpersonal relationships and social relationships.